Good afternoon and welcome to this online event, which is kindly supported by Saint-Gobain, the French multinational group providing materials and services to the construction industry. My name is Frédéric Simon. I'm the Energy and Environment Editor of YourActive.com. We're an online media specialized in EU affairs, and I will be your host for today's event, which is titled Transforming Our Built Environment from Net Zero Commitments to Action. Allow me to make a brief introduction to today's topic, if I may. 2021, as most of you probably know, is an important year for climate action, with the COP26 United Nations Conference coming up in November. And one sector which is catching increasing attention in this context is the built environment, which is responsible for 40% of the world's carbon emissions and consumes 30% of the energy we use, not to mention natural resources. We're talking here about the homes in which we live, but also our workplaces, hospitals, universities, commercial centers, and the infrastructure connecting all this. This is why there is now a growing focus on how the building and construction sector can contribute to reducing emissions and eventually bring them down to net zero in 2050 in places like Europe and the United States. But how can the sector bring about those emissions reductions? How can city planners, construction firms, engineers and designers, but also regulators and the people who operate buildings act in a coordinated fashion to reduce emissions? To discuss this topic today, we're very fortunate to have with us some top executives of global firms which are involved at different stages of the building value chain and have taken a leadership role by committing themselves to achieve net zero emissions in their operations. So let me welcome today Pierre-André de Chalendar, Chairman and CEO of Saint-Gobain, the French building materials and solution supplier, Hans Björk, the Chairman of Skanska, a Swedish development and construction company, and Ahmed Ismail, the CEO of Majid Al Futtaim Properties, a real estate investor and operator based in the Middle East. Welcome to all three of you, gentlemen. We will start this session with some questions to all three of you to better understand how corporate action can advance the decarbonization agenda in the built environment. And then we'll give the floor to three challengers who are all coming from outside the corporate world, but all experts in the field. And they will try to bring the debate further and widen the scope of the conversation. So let me welcome already now Christina Gamboa, CEO of the World Green Buildings Council, Clay Nesler, Head of Buildings and Energy at the World Resources Institute, and Joe De Silva from the Arup Group, a design and engineering firm. We will also take questions from the audience, so please don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat window, and we will select the best ones towards the end of this event. One final point, today's session is in fact the first in a series of three that Saint-Gobain is organizing on reducing carbon emissions in the building and construction sector. The last session will take place at COP26, so stay tuned, there is more to come. Right, that's all for me when it comes to the introductions. So without further ado, let me start by introducing again Pierre-André de Chalendar, Chairman and CEO of Saint-Gobain. Pierre-André, welcome and many thanks for joining us today. Can you please tell us why Saint-Gobain decided to frame today's conversation as being from net zero commitment to action? What does it mean for Saint-Gobain as a company to go from commitments to action?
Well, first of all, let's start with what we do in Saint-Gobain, which explains why we are doing that. We manufacture and we distribute building materials, and a big part of them are instrumental in order to help the users of the buildings to decarbonize their activities. By insulating the envelope of the building, our materials are of great benefit to the end users. So that's our goal. But to manufacture these products, we are emitter ourselves. And so we have made a commitment to reduce our emission, in fact, to get to zero net emissions on what we produce, even though, from a total standpoint, we are already very much positive because of the benefit we give, which is much higher. And in order to decarbonize our own production, we cannot do that alone. We have to work on several fronts. And I will use the methodology which is described by generally people working on these topics, what they call scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 is the emissions linked with our direct activities. That, I would say, it's our own action. We can improve our energy efficiency, change our processes, change the formulation of our products. We can work internally a lot, and that's what we are doing. And I would say from that, we can do it alone. But for the rest, we need others. Now, if I talk on scope 2 is the CO2 content of the electricity we use. And as you know, a big part of the solution when you have manufacturing processes will be to electrify your activities. But you need to have green electricity, and that's not up to us. And it's very different in different countries at the moment. So we need government commitment to have green electricity available. And that's why when we said we are committed to net zero emission, we need we are in the framework of what, for instance, Europe has said on their commitment on that standpoint. And then you have what you call scope 3, which is our environment and mostly our supply chain. And what makes it complex, and that's the one reason why I welcome this involvement of many parties in the debate. In the built environment, the supply chain is very complicated and fragmented. So we need to involve and embark all the value chain in the system, and that's why we need the help of others.
Okay, thanks, Pierre-André. So I understand that Saint-Gobain is seeking to involve all actors in the built environment value chain, but why do you believe such a broad approach is so important? And how can a company like Saint-Gobain help mobilize more actors in the built environment to take action on climate change?
Well, if you take the built environment at the end, you need its design. You need involvement of architects. You need a prescription agent. You need designers. You need manufacturers, and the materials. And it's not only a typical material; it's a solution. It's the way it is designed and built, which will make this built environment line with net zero emissions. And then it's the usage which the people are going to do with this building. So we need all these people to work together in that direction. And for that, we need a lot of tools. And I can expand maybe later on the tools we need, but we need to have everybody involved. We cannot do it alone.
Okay, thank you, Pierre-André. Let me turn now to Ahmed Ismail and Hans Björk for their views. And let me start with you, Ahmed, if I may. So you're the leader of a real estate development and management company that owns and operates hotels, shopping malls, and residential complexes across the Middle East and Africa. So please tell me, what does net zero commitments mean for your kind of business?
Thank you, Pierre. I mean, we all operate across the Middle East, and we are the leading shopping mall developer operator, as well as one of the largest residential developers. And we operate in a part of the world that, because of weather conditions and because of hydrocarbon wealth, is actually quite a energy intensive and carbon intensive economy. So this places on us, I would say, an additional sense of responsibility to make sure that we have collective, I would say, commitment and collective action towards net zero. We were one of the very early companies in the Middle East to commit to net zero by 2040. We did that on the back of COP 2021. And we felt that it's very important in our part of the world to take the lead and lead by example on that front. And for us, it's been a journey, and a journey where we haven't just been, measuring, reporting, and advocating, the transition towards more energy efficient and, circular economy strategies, but we've also been within our industry realizing that sustainability, contrary to common wisdom, is not a trade-off versus building efficiency, building livability, and building resilience. With the advance of technology, with the improvements that we see in sustainability measures, etc., we are now convinced that sustainability is actually a trade-off. The more sustainable a building and the more sustainable a development is, the more efficient it is, the more livable, the better the customer experience it provides, and certainly the more resilient it is on the long term. And we're seeing the industry as a whole now appreciating that more and more in terms of financing for new build, as well as valuations of existing assets, where certainly more sustainable buildings are demanding a premium in terms of occupancy and a premium in terms of valuation. However, we can't get to net zero on our own in our part of the world. We're very encouraged by some of the recent announcements. For instance, the UAE government has been the first government in the Middle East to announce a clear commitment to net zero by 2050. That's the first government in our part of the world. And we feel that there is a dire need more than ever, because that future of a net zero sustainable world can only be achieved by collective commitment as well as collective action.
Okay, thanks, Hamid. Let me turn to Hans Bjork now with same question, essentially. So you're at the helm of a leading project development and construction group, which is operating worldwide. So please tell me, what does net zero as a commitment mean for your kind of business?
Thank you, Frederick. First, let me backtrack. In 2019, the board of Skanska set new targets for our carbon emission ambitions. And the target for scope 1 and 2 is to reduce by 50% by 2030, with the starting year 2015. And then for net zero 2045. 6 years have passed since the 2015, and we have reduced by approximately 40% of the scope 1 and 2. I feel that the board will probably revisit the targets in the not too distant future, because the 50% target is not ambitious enough. What we produce today in terms of buildings and infrastructure has essentially been designed between 2015 and 2020. We know that the designs we're working with right now will yield significant more sort of carbon emission savings as we go further. So we will definitely sharpen the scope 1 and 2 ambitions. As it comes to scope 3, and for us, for Skanska, the scope 3 probably sort of accounts for 90% of our total emission. It's in the material, and I would say it's in the material is steel and cement or concrete that are the most dominant sort of energy consumption, and then in the usage of buildings. There we have set the target for 2045, but 2045 is sort of for my kids or my grandchildren to deliver upon. I feel that the board will quickly come back on setting toll gates for maybe every 5th year or so, because we are working with plans how we can sort of start this roadmap. And as it comes to scope 3, we only have a base for 2020. We don't have historical figures before. And I think one has to acknowledge that establish sort of the footprint or the where you start from is not so easy when you have, like Skanska, 7,000 or 8,000 projects, some with only 3 people on the site, some with 2,500 people. So get the quality and get the data collection is a tall task. But clearly, we will have to set targets for every 5th year or so. And how to get there is, of course, by collaboration by the producers of steel, concrete, and energy, I would say. Of course, transport is also very important for us, and then sort of all the insulation and cladding of the big houses that we build. So I think that when it comes sort of the roadmap, technology is within reach, and we have good collaboration with several sort of large suppliers that promise that they can deliver sort of green steel, green concrete in 5 or 10 years' time. It takes, though, an enormous amount of renewable energy to get there.
Okay, thanks, Hans. So turning to you both, Ahmed and Hans now. You're here today essentially because you agree with Pierre-André Chalandard that individual corporate action is not enough to achieve net zero emissions in the built environment. So could you tell us, how is your company trying to engage with other partners in the built environment to lower carbon emissions? Let's start with you, Ahmed.
Well, for us, we continue to firmly believe that this is such a global, multifaceted challenge that cannot be solved by one player of their own. And we have set ourselves on a mission from the outset to try to build a network of alliances that would allow us to be on a credible, measurable path towards our net zero or net positive ambition by 2040. That network of alliances has grown over time. I mean, initially we thought we need just to work with the government and have sort of a public-private partnership on some of the legislation, standards, and monetary incentives that could be provided. And over time, we've expanded that network of alliances to include some of our, not just key suppliers, but key thought partners as well in the process. And most recently, what we found a great network to tap into is actually the collective reservoir of commitment, excitement, and belief in sustainability within our young employees. So we have been tapping into that for ideas, people to volunteer extra time to work on sustainability projects. And the second, I would say, network that we're starting to tap into is the network of startups in various sort of tech fields that are relevant to our industry. And in both areas of tapping into our sort of in-house talent pool and external entrepreneurial scene, we've seen tremendous amount of ideas, insight, and technology that's helping us to accelerate, which I think at the end of the day goes to show how tackling a challenge like a net positive or a net zero future can only be tackled through these sort of closely knit network of alliances, perhaps across traditional boundaries of industry and private and public realms.
Now, Hans, with the same question, how essentially is your company trying to engage with other partners in the built environment to lower carbon emissions?
Partly it's on a country-by-country basis, since our industry is pretty decentralized. For example, in Sweden, we are working with Volvo on electrical yellow equipment, which for our industry is a source of otherwise big emission. We are working also with software companies in order to how we can collect data in a more efficient way. And of course, as I mentioned, we are starting to collaborate also with European steel companies, how to create green steel for the future. So it's sort of both at high levels and then at the very decentralized level. I think that's where I stop right now.
Okay, thanks. So let me turn back to you now again, Pierre-André Chalandard, for the next round of questions. So we've just heard essentially how big corporate groups such as yours are getting involved to reduce emissions in the built environment. But what about governments? What is their role?
Governments have a key role to play in that. I mentioned the issue of electricity, but clearly, we need signals. When I say that I need to look at processes that would be net zero by 2050, I need to know what is going to be the energy mix by that time. So the first thing is that for that, the best way is to have a price of carbon. And there are many ways to establish a price of them to give visibility and to understand then what is going to be the trend in terms of energy mix. That's the first role of governance, to put a price on carbon. We badly need that at the world level. That would be better. Already at the European level, that's important. And we have it partially, I would say, today. The second area is where the governments have a very important role to play is by setting norms or regulating. For instance, in Europe, there are directives that then are translated into the various countries, which establish the way new buildings should be, how new buildings should be in terms of their emissions when people are using them. And I think that has been very effective. So I would say that most of the new houses built or the new office buildings, and Hans alluded to that have been built in the last years, are going to emit during their lifetime, in terms of heating, in terms of air conditioning, very little compared to what was used before. The big challenge for governments is to do the same thing with existing buildings. That's a renovation package, and you know that as part of the recovery plan in Europe, the Green Deal, Brussels, and it's true also of national governments in Europe and in other parts of the world, are putting in place a lot of measures to reduce the energy spent within existing building by renovation. This is either through tax credits, subsidies, which is a different way to put a price on carbon. It's a negative price that you try to help people to move in that direction. So governments are very important, and we need their action as industrialists. We need their actions in order to deliver our own net zero programs. Maybe I would like to add one point, which is building on what Hans said before. I said that we need each other. I am a part of, even though I contribute, if Hans or Ahmed use more of my materials, their buildings are going to be much better. But the build content of their building made of the materials I have, I am part of their scope 3. So we need to work together on that, and that's what we are doing. We are all linked, but governance are essential.
Okay, thanks, Pierre-André. Hans, I believe you wanted to jump in there on the question of public procurement, which Pierre-André kind of alluded to. Can you please elaborate on that and explain what you see as being the role of governments there when it comes to public procurement and their role in reducing emissions in the built environment?
Thank you, Frederick. Well, the experience I have, and perhaps starting from Sweden is that the repeat clients on the private sector are leading the change together with companies like Skanska. And they're using the purchasing power. The public sector at state, at regions, and at municipalities accounts for approximately 50% of the total construction volume in Sweden. On the whole, I would say, with some exceptions, the public sector is not using their purchasing power. They're not using the fact that they can procure and lead changes. Many times it's just sufficient to meet certain targets for the government, and we are not rewarded for coming with better solution, more climate efficient, more life cycle efficient. So, I mean, my dream world would be that the governments would use our taxpayers' money in a more efficient way to drive the change. So that's one of the tasks. Another task for the government, I think, at least in Sweden, is in order to generate the net zero by 2045 for us, there will be a need for a tremendous amount of renewable energy. And the government processes to approve new capacity to be installed or new transmission is extremely bureaucratic and lengthy. And I think that that will be a bottleneck for the change going forward. I lost you there, Frederick. You're on mute.
So now you can hear me. Thank you, Hans, for reminding me. So we can turn back to you, Ahmed, for a question now about the role of investors, because we heard about the need to engage players all along the value chain of the building and construction sector, but the investor community needs to play a role there as well. And Ahmed, I understand that this is something where Majid Al Futtaim has been caring about this quite a lot, right?
Absolutely. We were one of the first, if not the first company in the region to issue green bonds or green sukuks. They were hugely oversubscribed, and demand on these bonds came from all over the world, which shows really the investor appetite out there to invest, in ECG and in low-risk ECG companies. And I have to tell you that, I just finished today and yesterday meetings with our rating agencies, and it's the first time that part of that biannual review or semi-annual review that we do with S&P and Fitch, a good chunk of our conversation is really about ESG metrics, our ESG risks, what are we doing on sustainability? And that goes really to show the big shift in the finance and banking industry towards green investing and green operation. And you just have to look at the amount of green bonds that were issued last year. I think it topped a quarter of a trillion. And that really is a major shift in the global capital markets that will continue to, I would say, be able to fund some of the investments that both the private sector and the public sector need to make in green infrastructure. And it will also be a way, I think, to reward corporates and create an added incentive for corporates to make good on their net zero commitments.
Okay, thanks, Ahmed. Pierre-André, turning back to you now on that question about the role of capital markets. So what does the investor landscape look like from the point of view of Saint-Gobain?
Well, it is changing extremely fast. And I think it's becoming quite positive because they are asking a lot now, pushed by their own investors. So the investment firms are really on it, on what Ahmed called ESG. And when I am doing the roadshows on the results of Saint-Gobain now, this this season has been an exponential change. Now, nearly half of the questions are related to those kind of topics we are talking about. So I think there is the problem is going to be to have a common language and to standardize, and that's difficult because there are many reporting, and as a corporate, we have to report many figures in different formats, so it's difficult. So we would welcome a standardization of the way to report. And I think that's also why, coming back to the first question earlier, we need a more common language, including in the built environment. And I think this language, in my view, should be around what I call life cycle analysis of the products. So you analyze at each stage of the products what has been their contribution, positive or negative. And in Saint-Gobain, we are quite advanced on that, and we have published more than 1,200 of these EPD. We have committed to have all our production by 2030 being covered by that, which makes us clearly a front runner in our industry. And that's an example of the kind of standardization that we need. But because the investors, it's not easy for them to really, when they look at companies, to evaluate the various contributions. So I welcome more standardization, which will also, and finance, the sustainable finance, as it's called, is working in that direction, but it's not easy.
Hans, I see. Yes, I was going to give you the floor. Basically asking you the same question about the investor landscape and what it looks from the point of view of Skanska.
Thank you. I can just agree with Pierre-André that things that happened very fast over the last 24 months in the financial markets, from a sort of a feel-good factor to an absolute must, and a drive both from the debt market, from banks and from bondholders, but also from the equity market. We can see it also when we started, for example, we build between 10 to 20 new office buildings around the world on our own balance sheet, i.e. that we own the land, we design them, and we build them, and then we lease them, and then we sell them. When we started with this sort of approach 10, 15 years ago and sort of increased the sustainable content of those buildings, there was some concern internally that this was just a feel-good factor and it will not pay off. History has proven them wrong, because although the cost for such building have been somewhat higher up front, we have achieved better rent and we have achieved much lower yields, which means that the final results for us has been better than anything else. And so I can see it from all sorts of angles that the financial market is essentially assisting us in accelerating this process. And if we do our job right, we get also rewarded by a higher earnings multiple on the stock exchange, which is, at least for the shareholders, of interest.
Okay, thanks, Pierre-André, Ahmed, and Hans, for sharing your thoughts with us. We're slightly ahead of time, but we can now turn to our expert challengers coming from civil society. But before I introduce them to you, let me remind the online audience that you're invited to submit your questions to the speakers. To do that, just type your question in the chat window, and we will select the best ones towards the end of this event. So let me now please welcome our three expert challengers. So introducing first Christina Gamboa, the CEO of the World Green Buildings Council, Clay Nesler, Head of Buildings and Energy at the World Resources Institute, and Joe Da Silva from the Arab Group. So many thanks to all three of you for joining us today and taking the time to be with us. And we can start immediately with you, Christina. So we've listened to the corporate perspective on how to reduce emissions in the built environment. But these are obviously three leaders industry that we just heard of. So from your perspective, what's holding back the others? What's holding back the laggers or those who are more hesitant to move in the green building space? And how can efforts, in your view, be scaled up to bring emissions to net zero?
Thank you very much, Frederick. Hello, Clay. Hello, Joe. And thank you very much for having us. I guess there's a key things that are going on why this is not happening at the scale and speed we need. We already heard that the built environment is a critical emitter, and unfortunately, it is also not seen to date in a central role as a key climate solution. And this happens because, as it was mentioned, the value chain is fragmented, but also there are some critical gaps. There is a communication gap between this sort of leadership and some solutions, but also the gap driving down that guidance and the best practice there is to be available for everyone to take on. In 2018, World GBC has been on a journey to fill those gaps and accelerate that journey towards a sustainable and net zero built environment. We know that by 2030, we need to move further faster. And in 2018, we launched a program called Advancing Net Zero. And through that program, we have been calling for total decarbonization of the built environment, at least by 2050, and having some milestones by 2030. Why aren't we moving fast enough? There are a lack of information in terms of understanding what is performance. Only 37% of countries around the world have building efficiency codes, energy efficiency codes. There is a lack of information, of data to track progress. And of course, there is also the lack of inspiration from governments to commit to bolder regulation. Some countries are moving faster, but others are not getting inspired to be in this journey. So that's one part of it. Definitely, again, it's not a lack of guidance and of best practice. It is the ability for us to trickle down across the world on the solutions. With the Green Building Councils, I lead a network of 70 organizations around the world. We have been advancing net zero, knowing that we have to be on the journey to get people to act on operational carbon and also on whole life carbon, on embodied carbon, which is an upcoming topic. And as we address those gaps, we can accelerate the collaboration and have actors share that best practice to enable an ambition loop where business shows the way, governments get inspired that it is the vision of the possible and that this can be accelerated and brought forward, and in a way that it can unlock the benefits that relates to people. And with that, I would like to go to the communications gap. People around the world don't get that the built environment is a critical climate solution, and we have to do better to explain it. And in that sense, we need to connect city leaders to also showcase how our day-to-day life can be enhanced by better energy efficient infrastructure that also addresses energy poverty and improves our living conditions. And so, yes, I guess I'll stop there for now to enable our panelists to come in and continue the conversation.
Thanks, Christina. So let's turn to you now, Clay Nedler. So what is your view on this? How can we scale up efforts to reach net zero emissions in the built environment?
Well, thanks. And first, congratulations to the three first speakers. Their organizations are indeed ambitious, taking ambitious action in line with science, which is what we absolutely need to do. Skanska mentioned that their goal is 50% reduction by 2030. That's pretty consistent with science-based targets, at least for scope 1 and 2. And a lot of organizations in the value chain for buildings and construction have very significant scope 3 emissions, which was mentioned. But we don't need a few companies and a few real estate organizations and others in the value chain to commit to 50%. We need the entire economy to commit to 50%. Now, luckily, the US has committed to 50% by 2030, a recent reversal. We have great ambition in Europe, but we have a long way to go to meet the needs identified by the scientists. We won't be able to do that as an economy unless cities do it, because they're 70% of the emissions. Cities can't do it if we don't do it in the building sector, which represents both the largest single sector of cost-effective emission reduction potential that can be done over the next 10 years, but also can be done at a reasonable cost, and in fact is an investment instead of a cost. But it's easier to do in new buildings. And Christina talked about goals of 2050. A lot of organizations are saying we should, only build net zero buildings after 2030. But the big challenge is going to be in the existing buildings, I'm afraid. Buildings, most of which will still be here in 2050. So that is the harder problem. When it comes to new construction, we really need innovation. One of my favorite net zero, and in fact, zero positive buildings is designed and built with Skanska as a partner. Congratulations. It's in Trondheim, Norway. If you can build an energy positive building in Trondheim, you can probably build one in lots of other global north countries around the world. It's actually energy positive, generating more energy over its life cycle than the embodied carbon in materials of construction and the end of life reclaim of the materials. But the existing buildings are going to be tougher, and we really need innovation across the value chain, including the renovation of buildings, which is much, much more difficult and more expensive, unfortunately, as well as how do we deal with buildings at the end of the life. If we take a life cycle approach, and Joe's an expert on this, so I'm sure she's going to bring this up, we really need to backwards from, do we really need that new building? We need new materials in that new building, and the materials we use should really be of the lowest possible carbon. We need to have that frame if we're ever going to achieve that 50% target. It was brought up in the first presentation about the role of government, and it is absolutely critical. A few companies being very ambitious, vocal is very helpful in giving governments the political cover and backstop to be ambitious. But we need the private sector to do more. Through the last 5 years of the Building Efficiency Accelerator, we've worked with 55 cities in 20 countries. We have 70 partners, 20 private sector partners, including Saint-Gobain, who's been with us for 5 years and is a leader in that group. We've learned 4 things to keep in mind. The private sector needs to be active. It needs to be practical. Government can't come up with effective policy in a vacuum. Going away, coming up with a policy, putting it out for review and having everyone pile on is not a particularly effective. Get private sector involved early. They need to be public. The private sector tends to really be vocal when they don't like something and relatively quiet when they do want something. We need this industry, the entire value chain, to be really excited about better building codes and about net zero and about life cycle approaches to buildings and a market for recycled materials. The private sector needs to be professional, all right? This isn't an opportunity to gain favor with government officials to try to win the next project. This is a rising tide, rises all ships, and we need the private sector to work collectively to increase demand for these more efficient buildings. We also need them to be patient. This is not something that will happen over the next 6 to 12 months. And with quarterly financial requirements and reporting, we need the private sector to really lean in here. One last thought. It is great that there are so many outstanding examples of building decarbonization and net zero carbon buildings. We certainly need more zero carbon buildings. We need an awful lot of them by 2030 and beyond. But frankly, we need less bad buildings. If we're really going to make a dent in this 50% target, if we're going to get even close to reducing the emissions in the built environment, we're going to have to stop designing and building bad buildings right away. And we need to throw our might into that as much as we do of having a few showcase lighthouse projects out there. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Klein Esler, for this. And so let me turn now to our third challenger, and that is Joe Da Silva. So same question to you. How can we scale up efforts to reduce emissions in the built environment?
So what's clear from everything that everyone has said already is that between us, we pretty much know what needs to be done. And I think the challenge is actually, where do we begin? And the beginning for me is as straightforward as getting to a common definition of net zero. We talk about scope 1, 2, and 3, but that's not sort of plain English that is straightforward enough for the stakeholders within our own organizations, within society at large to understand. The reality is that net zero carbon means reducing energy demand in buildings, typically in places like London, where I live, by 60%, in order to reduce operational energy to a level that can match electrification of the grid. And that operational energy is only part of the problem, because the other part of the problem, as has been discussed, is what's often referred to as the scope 3 emissions, the embodied energy, the energy locked up in the materials that are used in buildings. And I think the only way we're really going to tackle the embodied energy side of things is in two ways. The first is we really need to understand what contributes to the embodied energy in a building. One of the panelists called earlier for whole life cycle costing, carbon costing, or whole life cycle carbon assessment to be the norm on all buildings projects. And that's something that I would advocate for too. With the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, we've just been completing case studies of existing buildings to really look at where is the carbon if you take that whole life cycle approach. And what's really interesting is it's not just about the structure. It's very much about the amount of building services in the building, because those get replaced on a 10, 20-year basis. It's about the facade and how long that's going to be replaced. And some of the really innovative types of things that Arup, who I work for, has been pursuing is actually taking down facades, maintaining them and putting the same facade back up again, so that we don't start with a whole other suite of materials. I think we also have to unpack the problem. We have to unpack it in terms of existing buildings and new buildings. The issues are very different. I think the reality is that we're not going to be building as many new buildings in places like America, Europe, UK over the next 10 years. But we have to recognize that in developing economies, there are a lot of buildings that still need to be built. And a lot of those buildings are essential. They're schools, they're houses, they're hospitals. And we have to look at the problem, I think, in two ways. One is thinking about how we can retrofit, repurpose, rejuvenate the existing building stock to make sure that it's much more energy efficient, and that we can reuse it, better utilize it, so we don't need to build as many new buildings. But at the same time, we have to be thinking about very different ways of constructing buildings in emerging economies, which minimize the amount of materials, minimize waste during the construction process. The reality is that most buildings that are created are almost like one-off. Modular industrialized construction is still a relatively young field, and there's an enormous amount that could be done there to build buildings that are needed, and also to build buildings out of materials that are salvaged from other buildings. There's really interesting work going on that in countries like South Africa, which are dismantling buildings, salvaging the materials, reusing those materials. And for me, the real shift that this is all about is the shift to circularity, the transition that we all need to make to a circular economy. So instead of a paradigm of taking natural resources, making things, using them, and then discarding them, we actually need to get into a cycle of using and reusing, and so we're just minimizing the amount of new materials that we're using on all our buildings projects. The other thing that I think is really important is incentives. Somebody on the panel mentioned the importance of perhaps carbon pricing as an incentive. Whilst the market isn't yet consistently the market at the moment isn't yet consistently accounting for carbon when we're valuing property. And I would be very interested to hear what the panelists think in terms of how their attitude to their emissions and portfolios would change if, for instance, carbon intensity was brought in property valuation. This is something that's been explored in the EU-funded Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor project, CREM. It's something that we're advocating for in terms of certifying buildings to be carbon enabled, net zero carbon enabled, which means that provided the occupiers run the buildings efficiently and don't demand too much energy, the building could reach net zero. And then the final point that I'd like to make is we've talked about collaboration, and most of the examples that people have given have been collaboration with government, collaboration with industry initiatives. The collaboration that is going to make the biggest difference, I believe, is the collaboration up and down the supply chain. And the reason I think this panel is awesome is because we've got everything from material suppliers to contractors to the developer, all in the same room. The reality is that within the industry we operate in, our procurement processes are very disconnected. We have severe disconnects in the system between the people who conceive projects, decide to invest in projects, those who develop and design projects, those who contract projects, and then people who own, occupy, maintain projects. And I think really probably that if I could do one thing to really make a difference, and I really challenge everyone on this call perhaps to join hands and do this, is could we actually come up with a team effort which creates a building that truly is net zero, and that's achieved through collaboration from the outset of the project between everyone who is going to be involved in the project through its life cycle.
Okay, thanks, Joe da Silva, and indeed to our three challengers for those remarks. Now, let me turn back to our corporate speakers for a quick reaction to what we just heard. So Pierre-André, Ahmed, and Hans, would you like to respond to any of the things that Joe, Clay, or Christina have said? Is there something in particular that you would like to agree or maybe disagree with? And maybe we can start with you, Pierre-André de Chalendar. Go ahead.
I very much agree with all what has been said by our three challengers, and I think they built on what we discussed earlier, and so the difference between new and renovation, the life cycle analysis, all that I think makes a lot of sense. I would like to maybe bring an additional thing which has not been talked about today, is that we see that this coordination and this working together of the different people is not going to be easy. And I think that we have an opportunity with new technology, which is not technology on building, which is digital technology, to really facilitate exchange of information on these information which are critical, and to standardize the way we looked at the carbon content of the buildings before they are built or when they are occupied. An additional thing I want to say is to maybe bring an answer to what Joe da Silva, I think it's Joe da Silva brought about the measurement. In fact, we have in France something by the last regulation, which is not perfect, but it's answering what she's talking about in London, which we have what we call a diagnostic of energy performance. That is compulsory when you want to let or you want to sell a building, and it gives information not about the carbon content of the building, but about the energy efficiency of the building, its consumption, to heat the building or to climatize. So that's a road, I think, which we various governments could follow, and it has to be improved. It's not perfect, but I think there are already some experiments in that direction in some countries.
Thanks, Pierre-André de Chalendar. Let me turn to Hans Bjork, maybe, for some reactions about what the challengers have said.
I sort of smiled when I heard Christina talk about communication gap. Our organization, we don't have any plans. We only have projects, but we have sort of 7,000 or 8,000. It's a tremendous challenge at all times to sort of cross-fertilize best knowledge. Even within one country, then between countries it becomes even more complicated. This is a challenge for the corporation. It's a challenge for the industry, and we haven't. We have well, let's say digitalization has helped to improve communication or good ideas to sort of speed up the use of new ideas. But it is still very complicated. But one experience, though, when we started with health and safety focus some 15 years ago, because of the sort of horrible track record in our industry in terms of casualties and people being hurt, we started with the sort of notion of this was something that we should, keep as a Skanska secret, and we sort of behaved that way for a couple of years before we realized that the only way to make it change is to include our subcontractors and our competitors if we want to change. I think there's some parallel to if we want to make sort of accelerated change from carbon emission, that we should not work alone. We should also work with our competitors and with the subcontractors, because that's the only way to sort of in parallel move the bar, I would say. Then I have one sort of question perhaps to the experts, and that you have mentioned also the different definitions, the sort of challenges to compare. My question is, with the sort of the taxonomy that will be launched or introduced, will this simplify or make it less complicated to compare new builds with renovation and to compare different technologies?
Okay, thanks, Hans, for those remarks. I'll put the questions back to the challengers afterwards. And so let me conclude this quick round of reactions with Ahmed. So your reactions to what the challengers have said.
I mean, it's hard not to agree with the fact that, Clay said it, you don't need a few good corporates or a few big corporates. You need all corporates, you need the entire economy to act. The one thing I would just perhaps highlight is not to undermine, the power of a few good stories to be told and how that creates, I wouldn't say corporate jealousy, but most importantly, it creates customer advocacy. We have one case study here within our business in Dubai where we built the experience center for one of the developments to be a net positive building. It's a small building, it doesn't really move the needle when it comes to either our own carbon footprint or the cities. But that building has become a showcase, and it has gotten many customers and many government officials asking questions to their own teams and to their sort of suppliers, why can't we do the same? So I think the power of communication and storytelling is not to be underestimated. I also want to perhaps respond to the question around whether carbon intensity is being reflected in asset valuations and the discussion on real estate value. The short answer is not yet. But we have to remember, a few years ago, the building energy efficiency or the air quality within a building was not a subject of discussion with, asset valuers and, capital markets. Today, it pretty much is front and center. And I think if we look forward, I think embodied life cycle carbon will be part of the way investors and occupiers start looking at buildings, and perhaps learning from the journey on building energy efficiency. We should be coming together now, setting standards, certifications, and common metrics and definitions to make sure that when this discussion does happen, it happens based on a level playing field, common and transparent standards.
Thanks, Ahmed. I see Hans is asking for the floor. Go ahead.
Just another point there mentioned, I think Joe brought it up, the sort of the one-offs. And of course, the construction industry is dominated by the one-offs. Very few projects that we operate are sort of repeat type of products. But when we look at them, we have one sort of unique example in Skanska. We build together with IKEA an entry housing for single families or couples called Boklok, and which is built in modules and in plans. And when we have a repeat construction project, we can sort of meet efficiency standards by far, and we can drive productivity in a completely different speed than in the general construction, where there's almost always a one-off. And of course, wherever we go, whatever country, most of what we do are one-offs, and it's therefore it's a tall sort of task to bring experience from one-off to another one-off, really. And society has not been very particular, sort of kind to standardized construction.
Okay, thanks for that remark, Hans Bjork. Since we're a bit ahead of schedule, maybe I can use this opportunity to return a few questions back from the C-suite, corporate leaders, to the challengers. And so I picked up on that question from Pierre-André de Chalandard about the opportunity to use digital technology to improve coordination between the different elements in the building's value chain. That hasn't been mentioned at all by any of the three challengers. So maybe one of you wants to make a comment about that. Maybe Joe De Silva, is that something that you're involved in your day-to-day business activities?
I think it's a very important point to have brought up. We can't forget that we're tackling the net zero challenge in an environment that is also being shaped by digital transformation. And perhaps our ability to tackle the net zero challenge is because we're going to be able to do things differently, enabled by data and enabled by digital technology. I think then there is much more scope for common platforms. Most buildings projects now are using BIM. So there's sort of, shared models, shared platforms. That information is then available all the way through the life cycle of the building. This makes it much easier to retrofit buildings, to reduce materials in buildings. We're doing some really interesting work, which is actually installing monitoring in buildings, which is enabling us to see how a building is aging, and therefore enabling us to actually create the evidence to not replace elements of a building which would normally be deemed beyond their design lifespan, because actually you can prove through lifetime monitoring of data that they're actually performing fine, and therefore they don't need to be replaced. And I think the really big change that there's a few experimental projects that have been trying to do this is actually looking to circular buildings. One of the projects that we did was the People's Pavilion in Amsterdam, and that building was created out of materials. Every element of that building had its own QR code, a material passport. The building was assembled. It used no screws, no glue, no nails. It was all assembled together with connections that enabled it to be dismantled, and the buildings returned to the manufacturer at the end of life. It was a demonstrator project, but I think the potential of material passports, so we know what's in a building and can reuse those materials, it is part of the future.
Thanks, Joe da Silva. That's an interesting idea indeed. Let me pick up now on the question. I think Hans Bjork put that one about the green finance taxonomy, and I thought maybe Ahmed, since you're very involved in green finance issues, I thought maybe you could have a go at that one. So Hans was basically asking whether the green finance taxonomy will help to compare performance in the industry, and I guess help standardize it to some extent.
Well, I think from on the financial side, there is certainly some level of standardization that we're starting to see in conversations with investors, bond investors as well, with rating agencies and asset values. I think on the operational side as well, you've had multiple industry standards that are well established. I think the area where we still don't see much standard is this whole area of life cycle embodied carbon. That's clearly a sort of an edge of thinking for the industry that's not yet there.
Okay, thanks, Ahmed. So I think we have time now to turn to questions from the audience, and I see there was a number coming in. So I'll pick the first that was shared with us. And this is about, again, driving collaboration across the entire building and construction supply chain. So the question is there a possibility to develop a detailed pre-competitive planning process to drive collaboration up and down the value chain? So investors who dislike ambiguity might respond to a clear process. That's the suggestion. So who would want to have a go at that one? And I see Christina Gamboa raising her finger. Go ahead.
Not the hand, the finger. Yes, thank you. Well, I think here the World Green Building Council can share a project that's called Building Life. We are working with 10 European Green Building Councils and their national countries and the European Commission to build out national decarbonization roadmaps addressing all these issues. And so this is the way, this is our response. We were saying there is this great path forward of companies driving the vision of the possible. We are advancing a lot in reporting and disclosure, but the practical collaboration is to get the private sector also to look back to governments and work together to figure out how can we be on that journey to deliver on the net zero national plans, admitting that buildings are a critical climate solution. And so that response is actually building on whole life carbon roadmaps for decarbonization. And actually, we are asking through the ambassadors, and some of our panelists are ambassadors for Building Life, for the European Commission to address, for example, the upcoming revision of the energy performance policy to address whole life. And then through that work that involves all the stakeholders, we will be able to shift towards better procurement, better policies and signals, embed all the conversations we have. And we already have a Polish roadmap for decarbonization, the incentives, the conversation of what unlocks this vision for net zero in at least from the European context. So bringing together business and policy to create the vision and enabling bolder regulation to advance us on the journey.
Okay, thanks, Christina Gamboa. Maybe one of the C-suite speakers would like to also have a go at that question. So is there a possibility to develop some kind of detailed pre-competitive planning process to drive collaboration up and down the value chain? Does anyone, either Hans, Ahmed, or Pierre-André Chalandard, wants to have a go at that one? No, I see there's no real appetite for that. So let me jump immediately to the next. Let me jump immediately to the next question. So a question from the audience. The panelists mentioned about having some common sustainability reporting standard. Who do the organization look up to develop such a standard? And I see Clay Nesler raising his finger. Go ahead, Clay.
Well, it depends where you are in the value chain, actually. There is a nonprofit called GRESB, which is an ESG, environmental, social, and governance sustainability reporting service, essentially for the real estate community. It includes portfolio organizations which have very large portfolios. It includes REITs. So essentially the end-to-end real estate industry, and very many of the world's largest real estate companies are reporting annually to that. They're reporting their energy, they're reporting their carbon, they're reporting their water usage, they're reporting other aspects like refrigerant loss, things that have a very significant impact on carbon, but also addressing other elements of the entire ESG cycle. Obviously, for companies in the product manufacturing, design, architecture, and other sectors across the value chain, reporting to CDP, the artist formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, but now much broader than just carbon, is standard. And many cities and many of the customers in the public sector report to the CDP. So they're an important player in the value chain as well. So reporting to that, and then reporting according to the global reporting initiatives is the most comprehensive way to report. It's interesting to note that 70 real estate companies have already committed to science-based targets. That's a really large number considering how ambitious the science-based targets are. So where to report, GRESB and CDP, and what your target should be guided by science and the science-based targets. I'd like to just add one thing that piggybacks on something we talked about before. Are building owners being compensated for building greener buildings? And the research is pretty clear. There is a green premium for the greenest, most buildings, the highest BREEAM, the highest LEED, the highest China 3-star, etc. But the more important fact is that there is a larger green penalty for the worst performing buildings. A study of 3 downtown business districts in Australia showed that, yes, there was a single-digit improvement in a variety of financial factors in real estate transitions, vacancy, rent, things such as that. But it was a much more a penalty there. We only have to look to New York with the new local law 97, which will put a financial penalty of $268 per ton of carbon starting in 2024 for buildings do not meet successive reduction in carbon intensity over time, modeled in some ways after the successful Tokyo cap and trade program with the 1,100 largest buildings in New York. Boston just adopted this. We're about to see how elastic the market is to a price on carbon in the built environment.
So thanks, Clay Nesler, for all that. Maybe I can direct the question to other people on the panel, maybe some of the C-suite speakers, about sustainability reporting standards. I see Pierre-André de Chalandard, yes. So who is best placed, in your view, to develop such a standard?
I would very much agree with what has just been said on who we report to these institutions to get what we call, objective assessment of our situation, and I think that's good. What I want to add is that, in addition to that, we have to report to many other people who are asking us questions for other purposes. And I think that you have the rating agencies who have developed an ESG component. You have specialized rating agencies on sustainability, and then you have many investors who are asking their own questions. So these, in terms of standards, I think the one that have been mentioned are important. I would add that both the governments at the level of the US and Europe are also trying to build standard reporting. I hope they will converge. But I think at the moment we are seeing a huge number of different reportings, and although some are probably seen by us as more objective and standard, they are not enough for what we need if we want to satisfy our various stakeholders.
Thank you, Pierre-André de Chalendar. Somebody else maybe on reporting standards? Does anyone else want to comment on that? Yes, Hans Bjork.
Yes, I can only concur with that statement, Pierre-André, that the reporting standards are enormous. And every year, some large institutions are coming in with their own agenda and their own questionnaire. So it is very sort of consuming effort and sort of. But I would say that the largest financial institutions seem at least to come together, and I hope that we will see some consolidation, because I think they realize their own problems. I can see it from a large bank today, for example, that they will have to reassess their own loan portfolio, and that's not a simple thing. I mean, the loan portfolio might have been built up over 2 generations, the whole banking system might have, for example, to agree on one standard in order to compare banks with each other. So we might get help from the financial sector, believe it or not. Then I would just ask Clay one thing. You brought up the green standard, and that's sort of that's music in my ears, because that's how we are rewarded. I have a sort of a bit of a question mark regarding green premium for residential. In most markets where we operate, between 25% to 40% of the total construction is for residential projects. Maybe half is for rental, and if they're rental projects, they're normally owned by institutions that follow the same guidelines or are under the same pressure to improve the green footprint of what they do. But half of the residential is owner occupied. And for that group, I must say, it's been a bit more challenging to convince people to buy a greener home than before. And it has been difficult to prove that there are financial benefits to the owners. I don't know if you have any sort of experience in that particular field.
So Clay Nesler, that's an invitation to you.
Well, thanks for a really easy question. Yeah, that is a challenging segment to be sure. What we've seen, particularly on the public housing side, and I know you focused on the most difficult. On the public side, there does seem to be an opportunity to, through financial institutions, be able to leverage blended capital. We've seen a lot of successful case studies where the slight green premium, the cost of a greener residence, can be covered through at least initially, through a program, through a multilateral development bank or other more patient capital, to essentially build those homes and convince the market that they actually deliver the performance that is promised. What we're seeing in private owned homes is there's some recent research, again by financial institutions, that various incentives like green mortgages, which come at a slightly lower interest rate, or in fact, there's been some academic studies, and I work for a research organization, so I love the research aspect of it, that owners who build a green residence are much less likely to default on that residence. They're much more likely to pay. Therefore, one incentive is allowing lower credit ratings. So in other words, in the US context, a FICO score, which is the score you need to achieve to get a mortgage or a mortgage at a better rate. This is where incentives, which came up before, can really start to move the market.
All right, thanks, Klein Esler, for that. Let me pick the next question coming from the audience. I'm reading it out. Don't we need to reuse and remanufacture buildings versus always building new ones if we are going to advance towards net zero? And I see Ahmed raised his hand, and then we'll turn to Pierre-André de Chalandard. Go ahead, Ahmed.
Well, it pretty much depends on where you are in the world. I think if you are in some of the cities in emerging markets where we operate, where you have, big shortage of social infrastructure, road infrastructure, huge sort of internal migration, as well as raw population growth, it's inevitable that you have to build new buildings. Perhaps it's not the same dynamic in more mature cities. But I think one of the big challenges, even for emerging market cities and growing cities, is how to build new buildings that have multi-use or blended use. That we continue to design and build single-use buildings that have, at best, 50 or 60% utilization throughout, their useful life. And that is, I think, a big challenge for cities and developers alike. And then the question becomes, is it really easier to build new buildings that are efficient, and net zero buildings versus retrofit what you already have? And again, in emerging markets, the retrofit of existing buildings, given the building codes and standards that were in place just perhaps 15 or 20 years ago, make that retrofit exceptionally expensive. And as such, it makes the demand for newer built even bigger over time. And that's a dynamic that's sometimes not as well appreciated, given the quality of stock that exists in emerging markets today.
Okay, thanks, Ahmed. Pierre-André de Chalandard, you wanted to react to this?
Yes, first I agree with what Ahmed said, that there is a difference between emerging countries and mature countries on this standpoint. But what I want to say is that circular economy is going to become more and more important. And I want to illustrate that with the case of Saint-Gobain. We are lucky enough that in Saint-Gobain, most of our materials are recyclable indefinitely. And in fact, there is a very strong link between carbon emission and recycling. The more I put used glass or used gypsum in my glass furnace or in my plasterboard plant, the less to produce new materials, the less I'm going to emit CO2. It's much more efficient to reuse the materials in the production process and to have virgin materials. And that's one of our big KPIs, is the use of virgin raw materials. So I think the whole concept, in my view, in the future should be to have, whether it's new buildings or it's retrofit, to have the buildings as a kind of material bank. So we can easily deconstruct them to reuse the materials, because one of the major issues we have is that it's not easy to deconstruct and to collect the reused materials. At the moment, the major problem we have in Saint-Gobain is that we don't find in most countries enough of recycled materials. And so our goal would be, if we want to reduce our own emissions, to have more. And as we are going to have a resource issue, and on many of these materials, I think that the built environment must be a part of, as I said, a material bank for the future that can be reused, not for all the materials, but for a number of them. And in my case, in the case of Saint-Gobain, most of what we need is already existing in existing buildings.
Thanks, Pierre-André. Joe da Silva, maybe you would like to react to what has just been said, because you brought up this issue of reuse, recycling in buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's wonderful to hear Pierre-André talk about the fact that actually it's more efficient and more cost efficient to be reusing materials, not just using virgin materials. In answer directly to the question, should we always, retrofit existing buildings rather than build new ones? I don't think it's always. We're in the process of finalizing a circular economy buildings toolkit that we've developed in collaboration with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which champions circular economy. We're working on them on what circular economy means for the built environment. And it's a 9 steps in the toolkit. And certainly step 1 is stop, think. Do you really need to build a new building? Could you reuse an existing building to achieve your purposes? But as I said before, there are parts of the world where there's a deficit of buildings and a deficit of essential buildings. And so if there's not buildings to reuse, then of course we've got to build them new, and we've got to look at industrialized construction. I talked previously, and Hans picked it up about the challenges of the fact that so many buildings are one-off, we also we tie buildings together, so they are very difficult to dismantle. And I think if you're trying to imagine what the future looks like, imagine it's IKEA but at a building scale. And so buildings are assembled and disassembled, components are reused, components are broken down, and the materials remade into new buildings projects. There hasn't been a big shift in the construction market for decades in terms of what we build from and the types of technologies we use. And I think, in fact, that this net zero challenge is an enormous opportunity for creativity, for innovation, for new business models, new approaches. And that's what I think we should really be focusing on, is actually disrupting the way we've done things in the past, and thinking about how we do things differently in the future.
Many thanks, Joe da Silva, for those comments. I like the analogy with IKEA. It indeed helps you think quite differently from there on. So I think this brings us to the end of this conference. Unfortunately, it was really interesting for me to hear all these expert views and views as well from the corporate leaders. Many thanks to Saint-Gobain, of course, for organizing this event, and to our speakers, of course, as well, for their presence today. My personal takeaway from this event probably can be summarized in one word, and that would be scale. The built environment globally, as I understand, is indeed something which is truly massive in scale, and decarbonizing all of it is going to be a huge task indeed. However, from what we heard today, it seems that decarbonizing this building stock can be achieved. So the question now really is how fast it can be done. And I guess we'll hear more about that in the run-up to COP26. So now, before we close, let me hand over the floor back to Pierre-André de Chalendar for some concluding thoughts. Pierre-André, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Frédéric. I think you have summarized it very well. No, I'd like to thank all the other panelists. I think their views were very interesting. I think we concur on more of the on a lot of the points that were taken. And as one said, the problem is that we are all in agreement in this room, but we need to communicate that more broadly. And as you said, to scale up. But I think on the other hand, I think it's important that they are, front runner on that. And clearly, in Saint-Gobain, we want to be like, Skanska is, and we work very well with Skanska. He's a front runner in our industry, and communicating with others and embarking all the value chain is the way we are going to make progress, including advocating And I thank Christina for what and the other challenges for what they are doing on that. I think advocating more for government actions, because we need also government to step up if we want to achieve our goals. So thank you very much to everybody for participating.
Thanks, Pierre-André. On that note, I would like to thank again our speakers and challengers for joining us today. Thanks to our audience as well for tuning in. Like I said at the beginning, today's event is the first in a series that Saint-Gobain is hosting ahead of COP26. So we'll be back in September with another session focusing on reducing emissions in the building sector. Until then, take care and see you next time.